Hello guys and welcome. Today we have Blender open right now, and I'm going to teach you guys a little bit of a basic introduction to Blender, and this is of course Blender 2.79b, which is actually an older version of Blender. I don't want to use the new one just because this one is it has a lot of things from it that I'm a lot more familiar with. If you guys like pictures and all of that stuff to kind of guide your path, I'll do a little bit of a 2.8 introduction tutorial in the future, but for right now we're sticking with 2.79b here. And we're just going to show you how it works. So right now you're looking at things that are probably very confusing. You can obviously, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to start clicking on stuff that looks bright and shiny, like this blue arrow here, this green one, and this red one, and to figure out that that obviously makes the cube move. Well, if you click outside of that, it just moves the cube freely, just on like a flat plane, as if moving it with the camera view, so you're moving it along the camera lens, so it's not going further back or forward towards the camera or away from the camera based on the camera being what you're seeing from, but it is able to move sideways. Anyway, that's basically the kind of motion of the 3D viewport from what you can see, and that obviously is very appealing to most people who are starting out with Blender, because if you're starting out with Blender, you're going to want to do something similar to like make a shape or do something with shapes to like manipulate them or make different objects or do certain things. You know, you want to create stuff. That's why you are in Blender. You're here to create things. You're here to build and um, to learn a little bit more about animation, maybe to learn a little bit more about editing software, because Blender can be used for multiple different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be used for 3D animation. You can obviously open this up as a video sequence editor, and then you can just add your own things and do it however you want. But for today, we're going to use the 3D viewport, and we're not going to cover too much, but just to start off, we're going to touch on the user preferences, because what you might notice is that if you left-click something, it doesn't normally select it. I already have it changed so that it does, but that's because I went into a program here, User Preferences, which is underneath your File tab. File is where you find basically, if you know any other program with Windows or Microsoft, File is basically your settings. It's going to be your overall program management for the program you're using. So File helps you file through things, like a filing cabinet. That's why it's called File. Anyway, so User Preferences is where you'll find the different preferences that you can set as your own user, and once you get to know the program a little better, you can add your own things. You don't need to stick with the stuff that I put on. You can add your own add-ons, you can change up your own themes, you can do whatever you want to change these settings once you get to know how the settings work. I wouldn't go changing things without knowing what they are beforehand, so I would definitely look those up. Make sure you know what it is before you click on stuff, because otherwise you end up with options or buttons change or shortcuts change and you didn't expect it to change, but it will. So don't do that. Don't just jump right in and start moving stuff around unless you're sure that it's something that you want to do, because otherwise you might lose yourself and forget what it was you changed and not know how to change it back because it changes the program to something you don't want it to be. Then you have to do something like uninstall the entire program, reinstall it, and you definitely don't want to start over from scratch. So, first off, to change this, you probably have already noticed since I talk a lot, but it says select with left click or right click. You can choose right click, but if you choose right click, then if I were to save that and I were to left click, it would change the origin point. So if I were to create something, that's what this is, by the way, the red and white circle thing with like the cursor looking crosshair looking thing. This is a symbol of where an object is placed. It's an origin point, which is what it's called. It's actually, I think it is called the origin point or 3D cursor point. I can't remember the name of this particularly. It's not too important to remember the name, but if I were to spawn a new item, it would spawn with that being the center origin point of the volume of the mesh that I made. So it'll spawn it basically on that cursor, and if I change it to over here, it'll spawn it over there. So that's the purpose of that. Oh yeah. So that changes it to right click. So the benefit of that is if you hold, by the way, just so that you know, if you do end up clicking this away from the center here, you can hit Shift and then C, and it'll recenter that cursor right dead center in the very, or right in the very center of the page. So you won't have to worry about any of that. And I'll talk about like how I'm moving around and stuff in later videos. This is literally just a basic introductory video. But so that's that user preference there. That's the only one of the user preferences I'm going to teach you for right now, because the rest of these, honestly, I hardly use any of the other ones aside from maybe add-ons. Add-ons are very helpful, especially when you get down to like import and export, so that you can use different 3D models from different programs. So if somebody has Maya, you can use their Maya 3D model in Blender itself, or you can export Blender to a Maya format so they can use your models, and it doesn't mess up too much aside from maybe lighting the mesh and everything like that. So you don't have to use the same program. So if you get used to Blender and you end up working with people that work on Maya, you don't have to learn Maya and they don't have to learn Blender. It's very helpful to be able to work on your own workspace, which if you're here on Blender, it's probably because it's free, but it's also, believe it or not, just as good as Maya and Unity and all of the other 3D rendering softwares if you know how to use it correctly, which is what I'm going to teach you how to do. So basically that's the only user preference that we're going to touch on. These buttons here, they're very basic. There's tools on your left side here, which if you don't have this menu, it means that you bumped something, but you can use this menu by clicking on this little plus bar. More than likely, if you don't see the menu, then you can just click that plus, because that plus will be there. It's on the side of the 3D viewport. Same with this other side here. There's a plus here. This is a properties panel, which is going to pop up a lot of properties. We're not going to get into that right now. It's very helpful tools for a later time, but you're not going to need to know any of that right now. So we're not going to focus on the properties panel. But for right now, we are going to focus on this panel over here, which is the tools panel. So this is tools, the original tools tab on the tools panel, which allows you to choose what you want to do with the item. And if you know the shortcuts for this, by the way, like R, for instance, is for rotate. Double tap R is free rotate, so it rotates in a very free manner. The 3D object. G is for positioning. G, that's for positioning if you have like lines. I just realized that actually doesn't do anything if you just have an object. Like there's no double G specific like item. But there's G, which moves, R, which rotates, and then there's, let's see, scale is S. So it's kind of basic. You know, if you learn the shortcuts, it's a lot easier to just like, if I wanted to rotate it, I just rotate. I can move it, I can scale it, and I can do all of that by just clicking a couple buttons instead of having to go and click scale and then drag my mouse and then click rotate and then drag my mouse and then click translate and move it around. And it's a lot easier if you know the shortcuts. But if you don't know the shortcuts, that's what the tools panel is for. That's what a lot of these panels are for. Majority of the time, believe it or not, if you know the shortcuts, you hardly ever end up using any of the menus at all, because you can do things like move around to another layer, all of the objects that you have. So you don't have to select the layer or move certain objects based off of whatever. Like you can do it based off of shortcuts, and you don't have to hardly ever use these menus here. But just so that we can get over the clear oversight, so that you can have something to reference if you don't want to do it my way, the more difficult way if you think about it that way. If you want to have buttons that clearly and very easily tell you what is going on, that's what these are for. Mirror, it does just about what you would expect it to. So if I were to have this here and I click mirror, I don't think that it does anything up until, I mean, maybe it, I don't actually know what that does. So we're gonna leave that alone. I don't actually know what the mirror option does. I know there's a mirror modifier over in the modifier tab over here, which is indicated by the wrench, but I'll get into that later. And that allows you to be able to mirror, like if you work on this side of your mesh, it'll do the same thing on the other side. It's very helpful, but we'll get into that later. So mirror, I don't actually know what it does on this particular menu here. I've never used it, never had to. Duplicate does what you think it does. It duplicates the object. Don't really need that option right now, so no big deal. Control Z, by the way, is the undo function. So if you want to undo something and take back your action, let's say you move this over here, but you can't move it exactly back to where it was, because it's never going to be perfectly centered. And for some reason, if that bothers you, then all you have to do is click Control Z until you get it back to where you want it. Because what I did there was I moved it here, then I tried to move it back, so I undid the movement back over here, and then I undid that again by hitting Control Z again, and it undid it back to the very center. And that applies to everything. Like say I wanted to move the mesh, and I manipulated the mesh and made it a weird shape, and I didn't like the weird shape. Well, I can Control Z, and boom, it's back to where it was before. So that's a good shortcut for you to learn. The first one, and the only one I'm going to teach in this video. Control Z is to undo. Duplicate here, that duplicates your object. Duplicate linked, I don't think there's a difference. I think it's just duplicate whatever you have linked. Again, I don't think there's a really... I don't think this button, it could be useful to some people, but I don't think it's that important for you to learn. Oh, and if you hover over something like this, obviously it tells you the shortcut, which is Alt-D, for this particular option. Same with these here, S, R, and G. So it'll tell you what it is. Setting origin, so this is a very helpful option. So let's say you wanted to spawn a circle here, but you wanted the circle to start on this vertex here. So if you go into edit mode, which is by clicking the tab button on your keyboard, you'll enter into edit mode, or if you don't want to do that and you want the picture the very easy way, go down here to where it says object mode, and then click on it and change it to edit mode, and it does essentially the same thing. Then you just click on whatever you want. And let's say you didn't want a vertex. Let's say you wanted to spawn the circle on this face here. Well, right here is a handy little menu here with a picture icon, so it's easy to remember, of vertex, edge, and face. So if you wanted to choose a face instead, now you can choose based on faces. So if I click on the face, now it has that face selected. And what that does, if I were to, say, click Set Origin, okay? Setting the origin, it'll set the origin, the 3D cursor, that's what that's called. The red and white thing, it's called a 3D cursor. Sorry, totally random. But I can set the origin, which is the orange dot, which is the basically the beginning point of this item here. It's the where the item is based off of. So if you were to move that point, or if you were to link that point with some other mesh, it would move based off of that item. So if you rotate, it's rotating around that item, or if you move it, it's moving around that item, or if you scale it, it's scaling it based on that item. But if you were to set the origin based on something else, then you would end up with a whole different story, because you would be rotating. Let's say if I were to set the origin to this plane here, it would rotate based around the plane. So the whole thing, the entire cube, would rotate this point here to like over here, instead of rotating it to right here, because I'm no longer rotating around the center origin point, I'm rotating around this face instead. So there's a very handy button there that you can use. But for right now, it doesn't really have a point. So if I were to, let's say, move the 3D cursor over here, I could choose to set the origin of this object. Since I have this object selected, I could choose to set this origin to the 3D cursor. So that means when I rotate, so now just so you can see what I was talking about, when I hit rotate, it rotates the whole block around this origin point, because that's now the origin. So it expects you, when you rotate, to rotate everything equally based on that mesh. Every single part of that mesh is being moved equally according to that origin point. So it is moving it a certain amount of degrees. Since you're rotating, the object, it is rotating the object a certain amount of degrees. Like if I were to rotate this 45 degrees, you can see I rotated it 45 degrees. Well, it's just choosing based on the origin. The origin is choosing where the 45 degrees is rotating. So if it's rotating around this dot here, in the very center of the mesh, it would rotate the whole mesh 45 degrees. Whereas if it's rotating around here, it would rotate the entire brick 45 degrees. So you get the brick, if you were to look at it from this being the center of the circle over here, from where the origin was, it's moving the brick 45 degrees through the circle around that dot, if that makes any sense. I hope that made sense. That should have made sense. But if it didn't, that's honestly, I'm sorry. But just don't worry about what I'm doing right now, because it doesn't really matter. Obviously, this looks really crappy, and you're not quite sure what just happened. I know it doesn't make any sense. Don't worry about it. Just get that out of your mind. There, now it's back to normal. But this, I changed this for that purpose. So this is to show off the smooth shading and flat shading. So what smooth shading does, it does what it says it does. It makes the shading smooth. So if I were to click that, now it looks smooth. It looks smoother. I mean, it still looks really bad, but based off of the shadows and the shading, which is like a lighting effect, you have less flat area, less like sharp edges here. It's more smooth in the like texture. You can still see this is clearly a vertice, that's clearly a vertice, this is clearly a face, that's clearly a face, and those are edges. You can see the edges because they're marked, but it makes the object look smoother. So it's very helpful, especially if I were to not have applied that modifier. If I were to not have applied that modifier, so that's one quick way to just make your object smoother. So let's say I did this with a more attractive object so that it doesn't look so bad. Let's say I did that with this circle here. If I were to do the exact same thing that I did there, which is literally, this exact same thing, and when I were to smooth this one out, it looks a lot better, a lot more attractive. Yeah, there's these little tiny like jolts of wandering mesh that just seem really disgusting, but overall, this is not bad. It looks more like a ball than it did when it had all these faces. When it had all these faces, it looked like a disco ball. When it has this, it looks like a bouncy ball, something you would throw on the ground and have it ricochet and bounce back to your head. So that's the difference between smooth and flat shading. Flat shading shows off and emphasizes the vertices, the edges, and the faces. Whereas smooth shading tries its hardest to manipulate the mesh so that the lighting effects go across vertices, edges, and faces with virtually no physical appearance-wise change to the mesh itself. So it's basically manipulating the look of it so that it doesn't look like there's that much of a difference between them. But the difference is still there because you still only have so many vertices and faces. You don't have enough to make the entire thing. Now you can go and make enough by adding subdivisions and stuff like that. So now I have enough faces to where if I applied smooth shading, you can't tell at all that this is not 100% round. And honestly, it's kind of a little weird for some people to know the fact that you're never going to get a 100% round circle ever. Like, it's always going to be made if you zoom in. If you were to take this item and subdivide it so many times that it's broken down into such tiny squares that it looks so smooth, it's still made of a bunch of squares if you were to zoom in. That's just the way it is. There's no problem there. There's no reason why. There's no reason to question it. It's just the way it is. It's an animation software. It's not perfect. It's not like a complete science. It's not like we're actually building life. But that's that. That's smooth shading and flat shading. Data transfer, I've never used this. If you find a use for it, go for it. I don't care. This right here, this is another very helpful tool. In fact, like if you were to move this here, you can undo it with Control Z, which is a lot easier for some people because they just have Control Z naturally held with like their pinky and index finger on the keyboard. Like I literally have this button, like it's so regular that I already have my fingers positioned to where it's easier for me to just click Control Z than to come over here and drag the mouse. And I know that sounds extremely lazy, but like dragging the mouse all the way over here to click undo is just like, it just seems like unhelpful. But this option is definitely very helpful because there is, if you click Shift Control Z, it'll redo. But that's a lot of buttons as opposed to just the two that has to go with redo or undo. Then you can go to Undo History, which is like, this will tell you the entire history of what you have done with your meshes. This is extremely helpful because let's say I wanted to sculpt out a face here or something, and I just wanted like, eyebrows. I just wanted, oh, apparently I'm doing it mirrored this way. Eyebrows, eyeballs, there, some lips. We'll just throw those in there. I mean, they don't have to be perfect, but like, just because I'm like, it bothers me when I do bad, I'll make myself some lips. Okay, there. Gotta do at least a semi-decent job. Show you guys that I'm trying in a little way. Okay, so we got eyeballs here, which we can add eyeballs. Those are pupils. You can't tell that much because it's single shaded. So it's like, let's try a matte cap. Maybe we might be able to change this. Boom. Nope, that's the wrong one. Boom. There we go. That's hurting my eyes. Anyway, you kind of get the point. There we go. Now you can definitely see it. It's a little creepy, but you can definitely see it. So there's a difference. Boom. Highlight that just so that now it looks beautiful. Okay, if I wanted to make that face there, I did a lot of changes there. From every single time you click the button on your mouse, it manipulates something one time. So that's one thing that you have undone. So it helps to be able to have that history of undos. Oh, crap. Okay, go into object mode, and then you can choose the undo history. So it helps to have that undo history there because you can now, this will tell you the undo history of like sculpting I went into sculpting. That's what I did. So I went into sculpt mode. That was my last history thing based on this object. But it'll tell you what it did in that time zone. So if I wanted to undo specifically, like all of that stuff, I can undo the entire face that I made. So let's say I didn't like the way that that thing was looking at me, and it was a little too creepy for me. I can undo the entire thing and pretend it never existed. Boom. There's the whole purpose behind that. Repeat last. Basically, I'm pretty sure that this, I've never used it again. Like this, I believe, is just repeat the last actions that you did. So if I went into sculpt mode and I did this, I'm pretty sure if I were to click repeat last, that it would just do the exact same thing that I did. Which, I mean, I already did it. So it's like, it literally doesn't do anything. Then this tells you, of course, I think, the whole history of everything that's happened. So now I'm in object mode, now I'm in sculpt mode. It'll repeat the last action I took. But it's no undo function. So there's the undo. And that covers the entire tools page for the object mode. So whatever mode you're in, it changes what that tab does. Because right now, I'm editing faces. I am editing the object. That's why I'm in edit mode. So this opens up the tools that you can use to edit the object. Because now you're not just manipulating this object, possibly this object here, possibly the camera. You're not manipulating whatever object. So you don't have the tools to manipulate objects when you're in edit mode. Because now what you need is the tools to be able to do certain things to the faces. Let's say I wanted to do this. Oh, that was bad. And I wanted to subdivide that face, make it into more faces, so that I can manipulate more, I can have more faces to work with within that face itself. Let's say I wanted to do that. I now have the ability to do that because the tools page has changed, and I have the tools available to me now that would have been available to me at the start. So those change according to what it is there. Obviously, these ones here stay the same for the most part. Translate, rotate, scale, shrink and flatten. Those change just because you're now dealing with particular parts of the mesh, which shrink and flatten, that would be the same as scale in object mode. So there's no reason to have scale and shrink and flatten. It's just a needless button at that point. Push and pull is the same as translate in object mode because you're not editing any part of the mesh. You're just moving the object. So this is pushing it away from me, pulling it towards me. Like, there's no reason to have push and pull. But in this particular manner, you can see that push and pull has a purpose. Like, you can push or pull the object towards you, so it manipulates the entire object. So now if I were to highlight that, now that becomes part of the mesh. It's something that I have done to it. So it's no longer just a circle. Whereas if I were to pull and push the entire circle itself in object mode, I may as well have just scaled it up a little bit to make it bigger and then pulled it towards me like that. So there's no reason to make a whole setting based off of it like this one here. So those two, that's why they don't appear there. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that I know why there's a mirror option. I still have yet to figure that out, and when I do, I'll add it in a future video. But for right now, that's basically that. The mesh tools here, that just lets you select certain things, smooth the vertex, select the vertex, or this is the deform tab, so it actually lets you deform certain things. This, I don't know what it does, not sure what it does, not sure what it does, not sure what it does. Honestly, I know I'm saying I'm not sure what it does to a lot of things here, and you might be thinking maybe this guy doesn't know what he's talking about now, but the truth is I know what it does to a lot of things that are helpful, because when you're in 3D animation, very rarely are you ever going to be using half of the buttons that are here, which is why I wanted to make this video, to show you guys that even though all of this stuff looks complicated, there's not much to it in reality. And that is the long story short. And I will leave you guys at that one for the first video. And we'll see you in the next video when I explain a little bit more of the tools and a little bit more of the tabs here and go into more depth and more detail on that. And I'll also make a shorter version, more condensed version, which I'll probably add as a part of a video in like a thumb tab somewhere, or I'll just make a video series that you guys can go watch as well, which is short and sweet and simple, put to the point tutorials on how to do all of this stuff, where I will move a lot quicker through all of this stuff for those of you that are not absolutely new to this and might be wanting to change the pace up so you don't have to watch an entire 30-minute video like this one is, just to get out of me a very basic introduction to 3D modeling. I just wanted to make sure that I also have this video series here and available to you, because now you have a thorough, in-depth explanation to a lot of different things that you might not have known about if I hadn't gone into depth about those things. For instance, now you can go tell your friends that you know everything there is to know about this Tools tab here for when you're in object mode. I'm just saying, I think I thoroughly covered everything there, except maybe the join option, just because I don't remember that being there in the past. I'll cover that in the next video, so there's not big deal there. Anyways, I'll leave that to you guys, and I hope you guys are having a great day. Enjoy the rest of your day, and stay awesome. You guys are great.